They were the kings and queens of Hollywood's golden age, worshipped on screen, adored by millions, and believed to be drowning in wealth. But behind the glitter and spotlights, a brutal truth waited in the shadows. Some of the industry's most iconic stars ended their lives in poverty, crushed by debt, addiction, betrayal, or forgotten fame. From mansion-living royalty to welfare lines and borrowed apartments, these legends didn't just fade, they were left behind. Their stories aren't just shocking, they're heartbreaking. Because in Tinseltown, the cameras may stop rolling, but the price of fame never really goes away. Judy Garland wasn't just a star, she was a force of nature. Immortalized as Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, she earned over $40 million during her career, lighting up stages and screens with a voice and presence that could silence a room. But when the curtain fell, what she left behind wasn't wealth, it was a mountain of debt and heartbreak. By the time she died at just 47, Judy owed over $4 million, and her bank accounts were nearly empty. So where did it all go? Years of financial mismanagement chipped away at her fortune. Unscrupulous agents, controlling husbands, and shady business deals drained her accounts behind the scenes. And Garland, known for her deeply generous heart, gave freely to friends and family, often without thinking twice. But the biggest blow came from the IRS. With millions in unpaid taxes, they seized much of her comeback income, including earnings from sold-out tours and performances that pushed her to the brink. Her final days were anything but glamorous. She was performing in small nightclubs, exhausted, overworked, and still trying to dig herself out of a financial hole that kept getting deeper. When she died in 1969, there wasn't enough money to pay for her funeral. It was Frank Sinatra who quietly stepped in to cover the costs. For all her fame and unmatched talent, Judy Garland died broke, an unforgettable star dimmed by the weight of a system that took far more than it ever gave back. Ed Wood might be remembered today as a cult icon, but in his own lifetime, he was a man clinging to the last thread of a fading dream. Best known for the bizarre, low-budget sci-fi film Plan 9 from Outer Space, Wood worked tirelessly through the 1950s and 60s, writing pulp novels, directing cheap movies, and producing screenplays at breakneck speed. But no matter how much he created, the money never lasted. Most of it vanished into bars, bad habits, and forgotten apartments he couldn't afford to stay in for long. As his reputation soured in Hollywood, the doors slowly closed. Once promising film projects were abandoned. Old friends stopped returning calls. Wood and his wife were forced into a grim cycle, moving from one crumbling apartment to the next, constantly dodging eviction notices and begging for favors. By the late 1970s, their life had shrunk to a series of borrowed rooms and desperate phone calls to anyone who might lend a few dollars. In December of 1978, the sheriff showed up at their door once again, this time with no more options left. Wood and his wife were kicked out, penniless. Days later, while staying in a borrowed apartment, he died of a heart attack. There was no grand tribute, no final paycheck, just silence. He died broke, forgotten by the town he once dreamed of conquering. A visionary to some, a cautionary tale to others, Ed Wood's life ended the same way his films began, with passion, chaos, and tragedy. Bobby Driscoll was once Disney's golden child, a bright-eyed star who brought Peter Pan to life with charm and energy that seemed unstoppable. At the height of his fame in the 1940s and early 50s, he earned as much as $1,750 a week, a staggering sum for a child actor at the time. He was the face of adventure, innocence, and hope. But behind the curtain, his life was unraveling faster than anyone could imagine. As Bobby grew older, the offers stopped coming. Disney quietly cut ties. His transition out of childhood stardom was brutal and unforgiving. Rejected by the very industry that built him up, Bobby turned to drugs to numb the pain. The once beloved boy from Treasure Island and Song of the South found himself in and out of trouble, unable to find steady work, and rapidly running out of money. By his early 20s, Driscoll was a ghost of his former self. He left Hollywood behind and drifted into New York's East Village, hoping to start over. But that second chance never came. In 1968, his body was found in an abandoned tenement building. No ID, no money, and no one looking for him. He was buried in a pauper's grave on Hart Island, his identity only confirmed months later by fingerprint records. The boy who had flown through Neverland died alone, addicted, broke, and forgotten. Bobby Driscoll's fall wasn't just tragic, it was silent. And that silence spoke louder than any applause ever could. Florence Ballard was the original powerhouse behind the Supremes, a founding member whose voice helped launch one of the most iconic music groups in history. In the early 1960s, the Supremes were neck and neck with the Beatles, racking up hit after hit. But while Diana Ross became a household name, Florence's star began to fade, and fast. Internal tensions, bouts of depression, and a struggle with alcohol pushed her further into the background until she was quietly pushed out of the group in 1967. She received a modest settlement and tried to build a solo career, but it never gained traction. Without the Supreme spotlight, industry doors slammed shut. Royalty checks dried up, gigs vanished, and Ballard's financial security collapsed almost overnight. By the early 1970s, her family home was foreclosed, and she was forced to rely on welfare just to feed her children. The woman who once graced the world's biggest stages was now performing in small Detroit clubs for a fraction of her former worth. Despite efforts to rebuild her life and a brief glimmer of a comeback, her health began to fail. In 1976, Florence Ballard died of a heart attack at just 32 years old. She left behind 3 daughters, and barely any savings. While Motown soared into legend, Florence faded into obscurity, her name barely mentioned. The voice that once defined a generation was silenced by poverty and neglect. And the music world hardly noticed until it was too late. At one point, Bud Abbott was half of the most beloved comedy duo in America. Alongside Lou Costello, he delivered timeless routines like Who's on First? And starred in more than 30 hit films. They were household names, raking in millions and filling theaters coast to coast. But fame, like fortune, can vanish without warning, and when it did, Abbott was left with nothing but memories and mounting debt. The trouble started after World War II. Years of lavish spending and poor financial planning caught up with the team. The IRS came knocking with a vengeance, demanding back taxes that forced both men to sell off assets, including the rights to their most successful films. Their partnership with Universal dissolved. Studios no longer found them profitable. The offers stopped, and so did the money. Bud Abbott's health declined alongside his career. Without the income that once made him a star, he lost his home and publicly appealed for financial help. The man who once made the world laugh was now struggling just to survive. When Costello died in 1959, Abbott tried going solo, but the magic wasn't there. The crowds had moved on, and so had the industry. By the time he died in 1974, Bud Abbott was living in near poverty, burdened with debt, and largely forgotten by Hollywood. He helped define an era of laughter, but when the spotlight turned off, no one reached back for him. Not even the business he helped build. Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle was once one of the biggest names in early Hollywood, literally and figuratively. A silent film star with $1 million a year contract at Paramount, he dominated the comedy scene and helped shape the very foundations of cinematic humor. But one scandal would destroy it all, and no amount of innocence could save him. In 1921, Arbuckle was accused in the death of actress Virginia Rappe, a case that exploded into one of Hollywood's first major public controversies. Though he was acquitted after 3 grueling trials, the damage was already done. His films were pulled from theaters. His name became toxic. And the studios, once clamoring for his talents, turned their backs for good. The legal battle left him financially devastated. He spent over $700,000 on attorney fees, equivalent to over $130 million today. To stay afloat, Arbuckle was forced to sell his mansion, his luxury cars, and anything else of value. With nowhere else to turn, he worked under a fake name, directing short films in secret just to put food on the table. Even his friends tried to help. Buster Keaton offered him a percentage of his own profits. But no amount of kindness could reverse the damage. Arbuckle's public image never recovered. He died in 1933 at the age of 46, just as a comeback was finally within reach. Cleared by the courts but condemned by Hollywood, Fatty Arbuckle's downfall remains one of the most brutal reminders of how fast a career can vanish and how long shame can outlive the truth. Buster Keaton was a master of silent cinema, an innovator, a daredevil, and a genius behind some of the most legendary comedies ever made. With a stone face and unmatched physical timing, he became one of the highest-paid stars of the 1920s, earning $3,500 a week and building a sprawling Beverly Hills estate. But fame doesn't guarantee freedom. And Keaton's downfall began the moment he signed with MGM. Under the studio's control, his creative spark was dimmed. He was no longer allowed to direct his own films, and the carefully crafted magic that made him famous was replaced by formulaic scripts and flat performances. At the same time, his personal life crumbled. A bitter divorce from actress Natalie Talmadge drained his bank account, and years of heavy drinking followed. By 1934, Keaton filed for bankruptcy. His debts far outweighed his assets, and the estate he once proudly owned was gone. He took any work he could get, bit parts, ghostwriting, even uncredited roles, just to scrape by. The man who once performed death-defying stunts was now just another forgotten actor waiting for the phone to ring. Later in life, he found modest redemption. Historians and film lovers rediscovered his work, and small television roles helped him stay afloat. But the financial heights of his early years never returned. When Buster Keaton died in 1966, he was celebrated as a legend, but not as a wealthy one. His brilliance endured. His fortune didn't. And in the end, the man who made the world laugh died with little to his name. Dorothy Dandridge shattered barriers in Hollywood. As the first African-American woman nominated for a Best Actress Oscar, she lit up the screen in Carmen Jones with elegance, intensity, and grace that demanded recognition. But behind the red carpets and critical acclaim, her finances were falling apart, and no one came to help her pick up the pieces. Dandridge earned respectable money in her prime. She headlined prestigious nightclubs, starred in major films, and appeared on magazine covers. But the system wasn't built for her success to last. Racial discrimination limited her opportunities, and unscrupulous financial managers took advantage of her trust. By the time she discovered they had swindled her out of $150,000, the IRS was already demanding $139,000 in back taxes. Desperate to keep going, she sold her Hollywood home and placed her daughter, who required special care, in a state facility. Once a sought-after headliner, she was now performing in tiny clubs, far removed from the spotlight she once owned. The offers were few, and the bills kept piling up. Bankruptcy did little to stop the financial bleeding. In 1965, she hoped to restart her film career in Mexico. But that second act never arrived. Dorothy Dandridge was found dead in her modest West Hollywood apartment, with just $24 left in her account. She had broken barriers, captivated audiences, and made history. Yet in the end, her brilliance couldn't shield her from betrayal, racism, or financial collapse. Hollywood celebrated her beauty, but left her to suffer in silence. George Raft was the epitome of cool. With a slicked-back style and a dangerous charm, he dominated gangster roles in films like Scarface and Some Like It Hot. At his peak, he earned an eye-watering $18,000 a week, more than enough to secure a lifetime of comfort. But Raft didn't just play risk-takers on screen. Off-screen, he gambled with everything, and lost. Racing tracks, high-stakes poker games, and a constant stream of casino visits drained his massive earnings. And the irony? He gambled away more than money. He gambled away his career. Raft famously turned down roles in Casablanca and The Maltese Falcon, parts that later launched Humphrey Bogart into icon status. Those missed opportunities, combined with his reckless financial choices, sent his career into a steep decline. By the 1960s, the damage was done. The man who once owned luxurious homes and walked red carpets was now scraping by. In 1966, he officially declared bankruptcy, admitting he could no longer pay his debts. Desperate to stay relevant, Raft accepted minor roles, made forgettable appearances, and even did promotional gigs in Europe, anything to pay the bills. When he died in 1980, the once stylish leading man had little left. His estate amounted to a modest insurance policy and a few pieces of furniture. George Raft lived fast, spent faster, and bet everything on luck. But in the end, it wasn't enough. The Hollywood high roller who once had it all left this world with barely a hand to play. John Barrymore wasn't just an actor, he was acting royalty. Born into the prestigious Barrymore dynasty, he conquered Broadway with his Shakespearean brilliance before transitioning into film, where he captivated audiences in classics like Grand Hotel. He was revered for his voice, his presence, and his unmatched stage command. But even legends aren't immune to collapse. Despite massive earnings, Barrymore lived a life as extravagant as any role he played. Lavish parties, luxury homes, and a trail of expensive divorces drained his wealth. But it was his unrelenting battle with alcohol that truly undid him. As the years wore on, his drinking became impossible to ignore, on sets, in social circles, and eventually in headlines. By 1937, Barrymore declared bankruptcy, hounded by creditors and reduced to taking roles far beneath his stature just to keep the lights on. Once the toast of Broadway and Hollywood, he found himself typecast in second-rate films that mocked the gravitas he once embodied. Studios grew wary. Audiences moved on. And Barrymore, who had once delivered Hamlet's soliloquy with thunderous grace, was now struggling to remember his lines. When he died in 1942, the debts still lingered, and his estate was in disarray. For all his fame, John Barrymore left behind a shattered fortune and a legacy complicated by personal demons. He had once stood at the pinnacle of American theater, but his final act was marred by excess, regret, and a slow fade from greatness into financial ruin. They dazzled the world with their talent, their beauty, and their fame, but behind the curtain, many of Hollywood's brightest stars met heartbreaking ends. They weren't just victims of bad luck, they were failed by a system that chews up legends and spits them out when the spotlight fades. Forgotten fortunes, silent funerals, and empty bank accounts became the final chapters in lives that once seemed untouchable. These weren't background players, they were icons. And yet, when the applause died down, so did the safety net. In Hollywood, fame is fleeting, but poverty can linger far beyond the final scene.